Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to one of our new podcasts with Prof. Nando Challenge. Uh, Prof. Nando is very well-known pediatric endocrinologist who is very passionate about medical education. He's a humble person and he's very generous with his time and knowledge. He's happy to share his experience with us. So thank you very much, Prof. Nando, for giving us your time. And joining us today is Dr. Noorba Wahab. She's a consultant in general pediatrics and pediatric endocrinology from Saudi Arabia. She finished her fellowship recently, just in January. So she's consultant pediatric endocrinologist. Dr. Noor completed her residency at King Abdulaziz University Hospital in Jeddah and her pediatric endocrinology fellowship at King Saud University Medical City in Riyadh, where she also served as a chief fellow. She has a growing academic portfolio with publications and presentations in pediatric endocrinology, diabetes, growth disorders, and rare endocrine conditions, including the work that she has presented already at the SP the last couple of years. Alongside her clinical practice, she's actively involved in research, medical education, patient safety initiatives, and mentoring young healthcare professionals. So we are delighted to have her with us today as a co-moderator for this important discussion on the clinical applications of the IgF1 to IgFBP3 molar ratio. Grand. So after this introduction, I will start the session with my first question to you, Prof. Nando.
Okay.
So most pediatric endocrinologists are already familiar with IgF1 and IgFBP3 individually. So why do you think the IgF1 to IgFBP3 molar ratio deserves attention now? And what problem does it solve that traditional interpretation does not?
Well, let me put to you a different question, which is how often, when you're evaluating someone for growth hormone deficiency, do you see a low IGF-1 and low IGF-BP3? It's rather uncommon to have two values below -2 standard deviations.
Yeah,
And
you're
that
right.
tells you straight away that there's a problem with those markers as a marker of growth hormone deficiency. And we know, for example, that IGFBP3 is much better in very young children, in obese children, and IGF1 is adversely affected by nutritional factors, hypothyroidism. So there are factors other than growth hormone that are driving the system. And so, in fact, there's the three elements actually of the ternary complex. So we have the IGF-1, the IGF-BP3, and the acid-labile subunit. And if we only had decent assays for the acid-labile subunit, that's probably the best marker of growth hormone deficiency that we would have. The problem is we don't have internationally standardized, reliable assays and age-standardized puberty match reference ranges that would really allow us to use the ALS. But actually, ALS is really profoundly driven by growth hormone secretion. So IGF-1 obviously also is, but there are major additional variables that modulate it. So, for example, nutrition is very important. And it's also things like the thyroid function. So if you have hypothyroidism, your IGF-1 is lower than it would otherwise be. It's not completely, abnormally low usually, although it can be. So you're already finding that there are non-growth hormone factors influencing IGF-1. IGF-1 itself stimulates, it's through a paracrine mechanism, it stimulates IGF-BP3 synthesis. So, and then so I talked about the nutritional side, but there's also, which is actually primarily things like branched chain amino acids such as leucine, isoleucine, valine, which increase growth hormone secretion, but they also influence IGF-1 synthesis in the liver, and then on top of that, we have the effect of insulin itself. So you need portal insulin secretion. Now, if you think about it, normally in health, the pancreas is pumping out insulin straight into the hepatic portal vein. And that insulin concentration is much, much higher than you would expect in someone with type 1 diabetes, where basically the insulin is equilibrated around the entire body. But those high portal insulin levels are also needed for the secretion of growth hormone. And so what happens if you ever have measured growth hormone in a person with type 1 diabetes, for example, is that you have very high growth hormone levels in the resting state, just random growth hormone will be high. And that's simply a reaction to the fact that those low portal insulin levels are ratcheting up growth hormone levels. So this is an example of a disconnect between growth hormone secretion and IGF-1 secretion. So in effect, you've got growth hormone resistance at the hepatic level. IgFBP3 is much less affected, but it still is to a certain extent by nutrition and obesity and other things. But IGF-1 is much less affected. Sorry, IgFBP3, I apologize, is much less affected than IGF-1. And acid labile subunit is really only controlled by growth hormone. So that's why it would be the perfect marker if only we had a good assay for it and good reference ranges. So the ratio, where does the ratio come in? Well, in effect, we can use that, what I've called the molar ratio, or what is called the molar ratio, as a way of getting into this. Where are we seeing a different response? So if growth hormone hits the liver, it's then having these diverse effects on these three proteins. How can we infer something from the pattern of those proteins? For most of us, it's not easy to get acid labile subunit measured, but IGF-1 and BP3 are our bread and butter. That's what we're measuring. So you expect IGF-1 and BP3 to respond to growth hormone, but the response is different. It's different. It differs with age. It differs with nutritional status. It differs with protein intake. It differs with insulin sensitivity. So all of these factors play a part. And, for example, in celiac disease, I mentioned hypothyroidism already, but celiac disease, another example where you, in effect, have malnutrition and therefore low IGF-1, unrelated to growth hormone secretion. You may even have increased growth hormone secretion.
Wow.
So I hope that answers the question. They're really measuring different aspects of this complex regulation of IGF-1, BP3, and ALS.
Thank you very much for your answer. I will let you I'll let Noor asking you now. She's more polite and kind to you than me with my evil questions.
Yeah, I was wondering what the clinical problem that motivated you for development of the calculator?
Basically, it was something I'd known about for a few years, but I'd never used it clinically, and it's quite a complex calculation. I could have built a spreadsheet, but I thought I'd build a little app to do it for me, make it easier, and put in some interpretation. And I like having built the app. I shared it with Dr. Hussain, so I hope that he will make it generally available. And essentially, why it's come to the fore more recently, partly because there have been some more publications about it, particularly in the last year or so, which have highlighted that the ratio may itself be better, or is better, in fact. The evidence is that it is superior to either IGF-1 or BP3 alone. So using the ratio, I'm not a great fan of ratios normally, I should say. But in this instance, I think it is a valuable additional tool, at least until we come up with something better.
Thank you, Doc.
If I have only 1 minute with you and I ask you to convince me, a busy endocrinologist in busy clinic, to start calculating the molar ratio tomorrow, what would be the argument?
Well, Because the sensitivity and specificity are superior to either IGF-1 or BP3 alone. So that would be the main thing that I would say that should persuade you. And the availability of a simple tool to calculate it will also make it less painful. And the tool I've devised will work with multiple different units of measurement. So you just have to select the right units for whatever your lab has done, or whatever often the patient is coming with labs from sent elsewhere. It's not even your lab, it's some other lab. So, you can analyze the molar ratio or derive the molar ratio very simply just by entering in the data and selecting the right units.
Wonderful. So without taking further of your time, I know that you prepared a small presentation for us, and we got audience now who's got interested to learn about the molar ratio. So I will let you go ahead with your presentation, and then we will ask you afterwards.
Okay.
Thank you.
So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So the idea of the molar ratio, as it says, is in the bottom there, is to add diagnostic utility beyond what IGF-1 and BP3 can tell us individually. I've been a big fan over the years of the Groot criteria from Holland for selecting patients for evaluation of growth hormone deficiency. And in the Groot criteria, IGF-1 below -1 standard deviation, IgFBP3 below -1 standard deviation are considered indicators of potential growth hormone deficiency. And obviously that's within the normal range. So there's already highlighting a problem with the reference ranges. They're not telling us what they purport to measure. And the molar ratio is really a way of just synthesizing those into a single number. And it's useful in a range of conditions. So I've sort of partly reviewed some of this physiology, but we have the ternary complex, this complex of IGF-1, IgFBP3, and ALS, which sails around in the blood. And really the purpose of the complex is to prolong the duration of action of IGF-1, and so that you maximize growth hormone exposure. And so many patients patients with idiopathic short stature may have variations or variants rather in the ALS protein, which make the complex less stable, and you have shorter duration of action of IGF-1. And it may have, it does have a significant effect on final adult height, but we're typically talking about half a standard deviation, between -2.5 and maybe -1.5 standard deviations. So whereas if we say the normal range is, or the normal expected standard deviation score is 0, so we're talking about a significant loss of height, even with minor variants of ALS. So 80% of the IGF-1 is in the complex and is circulating, but the free IGF-1 level is very low. And actually what the ratio is doing is it's essentially giving us an indicator of the bioactive IGF-1. And or what you might call the free IGF-1. There are assays for free IGF-1. I spoke to a world expert on free IGF-1 and IGF-1 physiology generally, and he told me that just none of the assays are really suitable for prime time yet. They're difficult to reproduce, and therefore, if we don't have free IGF-1. So if free IGF-1 is akin to free T4. Why do we measure free T4 rather than total T4? Because it's actually the stuff that's doing the job. So we don't have a good index for free IGF-1 or a good clinical tool for free IGF-1. So the ratio could be that. So the molar ratio is giving us an insight into that. And is telling us about the difference or the balance between IGF-1 production and IgFBP3 binding, which are both growth hormone dependent. And they add really a diagnostic signal that you won't otherwise get. So IGF-1 you have your standard formula. I mean, many labs in Dubai certainly use nanograms per milliliter. Same for IgFBP3. And so to compare them, to do a molar ratio, you have to do some mathematics based on the molecular weight of the two molecules. So, and all of this can happen seamlessly in the background with the app, so you don't have to pain yourself. Now, some people just do a ratio of the mass units themselves. So the yellow panel in the middle there shows what the ratio would be if you were just doing the mass comparison. But that's not appropriate, really. You should be looking at molecule for molecule, because IGF1, IgFBP3, and ALS are all in a 1-to-1-to-1 relationship in the ternary complex. So the reference range for the ratio is 0.1 to 0.25, and that's been found from various studies dating right back to 2014. But as I mentioned, it's really only become more recognized as an important tool recently, or relatively recently. And you get these 4 distinctive patterns. So if you have a low ratio, so you've got low IGF1 and low IgFBP3, then growth hormone deficiency is the most likely. I mean, obviously, if you've got low IGF1 and BP3, you're thinking that already without doing the calculation. And I'm not saying you should do the ratio, but in this situation, because it's sort of self-evident. But you could also see the same thing in growth hormone resistance. So a child with Laron syndrome, or a lesser degree of growth hormone resistance, will have potentially the appearance of growth hormone deficiency. Now, what you then have to do is the growth hormone stimulation test to go into that. And what you'll see in growth hormone resistance is a very high IGF1. What's high? Well, greater than 13.3. And if we look at a situation where you have partial growth hormone resistance, so this might be some of the Russell-Silvers or Noonan syndrome, they're commonly somewhat growth hormone resistant, or bioinactive growth hormone, where your growth hormone can't actually bind to the growth hormone receptor. And then you can also have a low ratio, but you'll have that high growth hormone on the stimulation test. Now, in the child with familial short stature or constitutional delay, then this is the characteristic situation when we find ourselves in doubt. Is this short child in front of me, with the bone age 2.5 years delayed, is this growth hormone deficiency, or is this something that's physiological, such as familial short stature would be another cause. So looking at the ratio can actually guide you. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't consider doing a growth hormone test. That's still your prerogative. Ultimately, as I'm fond of saying, growth hormone deficiency is a clinical diagnosis. You need to look at all of the evidence to gather your opinion about it. Now, sometimes the ratio can be high, and this would classically be in acromegaly, growth hormone secreting tumor pouring out IGF, or resulting in an outpouring of IGF1. You're going to have a high ratio. So in excess of what IgFBP3 is synthesized, you'll be making a lot more IGF1. Similarly, if you were on growth hormone treatment and you were having too high a dose of growth hormone, you'll have a high ratio. So that's useful, because you might have a situation where the IGF1 is high, but the IgFBP3 is also somewhat high, and maybe actually the ratio is normal. And so then you wouldn't be so concerned about that high IGF1, because actually the bioactive IGF1 is not high, and the ratio can tell you this. And if we look at sensitivity and specificity, so the sensitivity of IGF1 is in green on the bars on the right. You can see the sensitivity is around 87%. For the ratio, for IGF1 alone, it's around 74%, and for IgFBP3 alone, around 68%. for sensitivity. And similarly, you can see the other panels, and you can see the negative predictive value. They're showing a very high score. So if you've got a triple low pattern, so low IGF1, low BP3, and low ratio, then you've got a specificity approaching 98%, 97.7% for growth hormone deficiency. And conversely, a normal ratio has a negative predictive value of 94.7%. So it might reduce the number of stimulation tests you feel obliged to do if you use the ratio. And I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of patients who come to see me, they just want growth hormone. They don't really want to know the science or the what we do. We want to be scientists in our work. Ideally, we should want to be. So I just think it's better than the IGF1 or BP3 separately. So let's look at a case. So Amara, IGF1 of 68, so within the reference range. So minus 1.3 standard deviations. IgFBP3 also a little bit below that -1 I was talking about earlier from the Groot criteria. So minus 1.1. So you might think, well, those are both normal, but actually I would still be suspicious if the girl was short. And you can see that she's got a minus 2.4 standard deviations. She's got a slow growth rate, and her bone age is 18 months delayed. So, and actually the molar ratio gives the game away. She's got a low ratio, so that's in keeping with growth hormone deficiency. And, I have seen people, often, for example, insurance will challenge you. Why are you wanting to do a growth hormone test when the IGF1 and BP3 are normal? Well, actually, it's the relationship between them that reveals the secret. That low molar ratio can be very helpful. So she went on to have growth hormone testing. Each had a peak, the highest of the two peaks, 4.2, and so started growth hormone. So I think it can be helpful. I mean, I personally, if I'm seeing IGF1 and BP3, but both below -1, I'm doing the growth hormone test anyway. But I think there are plenty of people who aren't aware that you can have growth hormone deficiency with a low normal range value for both of those analytes. So here we've got an example. You could have 3 children at the same height standard deviation score. But then when we look at the values, we can actually arrive at a diagnosis much more readily. So, for example, in growth hormone deficiency, as we discussed, you've got the triple low. So the IGF1, IGFBP3, and the ratio are all low. You have a low growth hormone peak on stimulation testing. If you were to measure growth hormone binding protein, which is actually just the extracellular domain of the growth hormone receptor that's cleaved off at the cell surface, so it circulates in the blood, it doesn't appear to have any physiological role. But if you were to measure it, it would be normal. You would see normal levels. Now, in constitutional delay, you would have a low IGF1 for age, although a normal IGF1 for bone age. And I think that's rather important. You have to consider the bone age in these things. The IGF-BP3 SD score, also low for age, but again, normal for bone age. And the molar ratio is normal. So there's a normal relationship between IGF1 and BP3. The free IGF1 is normal. And growth hormone stimulation with priming, if it's a boy with constitutional delay, as it normally is, you would expect to see a normal peak growth hormone level, whatever that means, by the way, because I have a lot of skepticism about a lot of what is spoken about growth hormone levels in childhood. Bone age, as I already said, would be delayed. And then growth hormone resistance, so the other side of this coin, you have low IGF1, low BP3, molar ratio is low, but a high growth hormone peak. And so then the next step would be an IGF generation test. That's where you give growth hormone. Typically, by convention, over about 4 days. whether that's ideal is another matter, but maybe with the advent of long-acting growth hormone, we could just give a single shot of one of the weekly growth hormones and do that. But and the growth hormone binding protein, if you have access to it, not obviously everyone has access to these eclectic tests. So, and the growth hormone stimulation test really helps you interpret those values. So I think it's very, very important that an apparently, quotes, normal growth hormone level on a growth hormone test, i.e. level greater than 10, does not actually exclude growth hormone deficiency. If you have bioinactive growth hormone where half your growth hormone isn't working because it can't bind to the growth hormone receptor, it will look like growth hormone resistance, and actually it's bioinactive growth hormone. And those children respond very, very well indeed to growth hormone. So I'll cover that in a bit more detail later. So here's a story of James. So he's got an IgF1 of minus 1.8 standard deviations. Bone age is really not significantly delayed, minus 0.4 standard deviations, and his molar ratio is normal. So this is a child who really doesn't need growth hormone. If they need something, it's pubertal induction. If it's a boy who's very distressed about his height, then you might consider inducing puberty with testosterone. And I think it's helpful to the parents, helpful to the parents and the boy himself to know that he will be all right in the end. But the problem is now, the nature of school is that we corral children into identical year age groups, and they're comparing themselves with their peers. And so this is hard for them. So that boy, if you're saying, well, in 2.5 years, you'll be in your pubertal growth spurt, and he's only 11.5 now, you think, oh my goodness, that's a long time to wait. That's his whole secondary school, the rest of his secondary school life that will be dominated by him feeling, that he's so different from everyone else. And there's a certain amount of reassurance to be had from saying, well, you'll be all right in the end, but you also may need to do something now. And that obviously is individually variable. So if we look at the high growth hormone and low IGF1, the resistance picture that we were speaking about, so you can have, the question is, where is the block? And actually the IGF generation test that I mentioned is a very good clue to where that block is. So if you have access to the growth hormone binding protein level, that's actually measuring the extracellular growth hormone receptor. And you'll see that if there's a Laron syndrome mutation, you're making tons and tons of growth hormone, but the growth hormone receptor is broken, or the second messenger signaling is broken. So we call that Laron syndrome. There are less severe mutations in the receptor that cause sort of an intermediate growth hormone resistance picture. Not quite as bad, but they're very, very short. You're talking about an average final height of around 115 centimeters, unless you intervene with IGF1 therapy. And then we can have situations where the growth hormone binding protein is normal. So you give growth hormone. So the growth hormone peak is high on a growth hormone test. You give growth hormone, you see, is there a physiological response? But no, there isn't, because fundamentally the second messenger signaling has failed. So the signal is not going. It's like having a broken light switch. You might be pressing the switch correctly, but if the wiring is faulty, no second messenger signal gets to the cell nucleus, and nothing is leading to the transcription of more IGF1. And if you could measure it, the acid labile subunit would be low. So this would be things like STAT5B deficiency, a nasty condition, particularly in the homozygous state, and ALS deficiency, which I already mentioned, although the short stature is relatively modest in that condition, or it is autosomal dominant. So just be aware that, the short parent in front of you probably also has it. And you have this post-receptor growth hormone resistance or insensitivity. And the ideal thing would be to do either a short stature gene panel or a whole exome panel, depending on your access to testing. I mean, what we used to do in Al Jalila was a whole exome panel. So, if need be, we don't find anything on the initial look at the short stature genes, we still have the option to go and look a bit further in the future. Now, if you've got growth hormone binding protein present in the blood, normally, at a normal level, you've got growth hormone receptors. That's what it's telling you. You've got a normal peak on the growth hormone stimulation test. When I say normal, that just means greater than 10 or greater than 7, whatever your target for growth hormone is. And you pass the IGF generation test, then this is when you have the classic neurosecretory dysfunction. In other words, in the artificial stimulation test, you make growth hormone, but in real life, you're not. Or you have bioinactive growth hormone, where your growth hormone is not capable of binding to the growth hormone receptor. This was first described by Bauman in about 1987. Then you would go to a growth hormone treatment, a therapeutic treatment trial over at least 6 months. A year is better because of annual fluctuation in growth. So in the UK, the peak growth is typically in the spring and early summer. In the UAE, I've observed that children seem to grow best over the winter months, sort of November to February. And I'd be interested to know what your observations would be about that. So I think the ratio is giving you some extra information, and that's helpful. So here's a case of Marco. So he's an extremely short boy with a very poor height velocity. He's got a bone age moderately delayed, just a year, and his height is declining relatively, so he's losing his centile, as it were, with time, and he's got a normal growth hormone stimulation test result. But we look at the molar ratio, and you see he's got a very low IgF1, IgFBP3 ratio. So if we do the generation test and he's getting a good rise in growth hormone, I'm sorry, I've chopped off the end of that box there, then you can conclude that he has bioinactive growth hormone. And so he would actually respond to growth hormone therapy. So he's got normal growth hormone, low bioactive IGF1, and an intact growth hormone pathway. So the low molar ratio gives you a real valuable clue with a child who's got a, quotes, normal growth hormone test. I remember the first child I diagnosed with bioinactive growth hormone in the UAE, and she came to me, very short child, and classic appearance of growth hormone deficiency. And she'd had a growth hormone test done elsewhere, which showed a peak level of 18, and this was interpreted as being normal, but it wasn't normal. It was abnormal. And she indeed grew very well with growth hormone. So, okay, what about monitoring? So we can use the ratio in monitoring growth hormone therapy. So if you've got a normal level between, well, ideally with growth hormone therapy, you're aiming for the upper normal range. Some people say just greater than 0. But I prefer to be upper normal if possible. And the free IGF-1 will not be in excess if you measure both on growth hormone treatment. And I do measure both IGF-1 and BP3 on treatment. And there's other reasons why that can be helpful. The IgFBP3 has a much longer half-life than IGF-1. So if the child has taken the growth hormone the night before, maybe his IGF-1 will be fine, but his IgFBP3 will give the game away that he's actually missing doses. Now, if you've got a high so panel B, you've got a high IGF-1, even with a normal IgFBP3, it still may be proportionate. So there's still a problem. So this is actually some actual results from a child I saw very recently. And you can see that the ratio is within the reference range. So you could say, well, she's not being exposed to excessive growth hormone, but still, we don't need her IGF-1 and BP3 to be +4 standard deviation. So I would still reduce the growth hormone, but I would recheck it in 3 months. Now, if you've got a high IGF-1 and a high ratio, that tells you this is excessive free IGF-1, and that is a safety concern. Now, we don't truly have data on whether high IGF-1 in childhood is dangerous, but we know that in adults with high IGF-1, just spontaneously, not because they're on growth hormone treatment, so middle-aged adults have a much higher rate of things like colon cancer, breast cancer. Acromegalic patients have increased colon cancer, thyroid cancer. So there are reasons for thinking that it's not a good thing, even if we know of no definite harm in childhood. And then panel D, you've got a low IGF-1 and low BP3 and a low molar ratio. This is the child who's basically not taking it. So then, or maybe I'm being unkind, maybe the pen is broken or whatever, but basically they're not getting the growth hormone you think they're getting. Maybe the growth hormone is all frozen, and after it's thawed again, they didn't notice that there'd been this problem. So really you have to look at adherence when you get that pattern. Now, you can actually monitor the ratio over time as well. So here's the case of Sophia, 10-year-old girl, and you can see if you track the ratio over time, that by 18 months, she's got a high IGF-1, and the molar ratio is high, so she has a reduction in her growth hormone. And by 24 months, so 6 months later, you can see the ratio has normalized now to a nice healthy level. So the IGF-1 was high, but the elevated ratio confirmed that it was a high signal and not just something that could be watched. So I think that was a helpful case in point. And we have distinctive patterns that you can see with each of these genetic syndromes. So in Laron syndrome, which we've already touched on, you have a very low ratio, like growth hormone deficiency, basically, but it's growth hormone resistance. And some patients have a downstream problem with the growth hormone receptor. So if you remember your growth hormone physiology, so growth hormone binding to the growth hormone receptor stimulates a second receptor to dock with the growth hormone growth hormone receptor complex. You actually have two growth hormone molecules in a Y with the growth hormone bound, and that stimulates JAK, which is a kinase. JAK stands for just another kinase, or Janus-associated kinase, depending on which you believe. And JAK kinase's job is to phosphorylate STAT5B, and STAT5B is the enhancer of secretion of IGF-1, IgFBP3, and ALS. ALS has a lot more STAT5B promoters in the promoter region of the gene than IGF-1 or BP3. So that's why ALS is really only driven by growth hormone. It's not affected by other parameters that can hoodwink you into thinking that there's some other problem going on. And then the relatively uncommon, or perhaps I should say uncommonly recognized, because I think a lot of people don't look, a lot of people are not getting genetic testing for their unexplained short stature. But if you have the option to test, I think it's a good idea. I mentioned it's autosomal dominant, so it may well be that very short parent in front of you has passed on their gene to their offspring, and Hence, there are other siblings who may be affected by the same thing. So you can have, with ALS deficiency, your growth hormone level will look normal, but your IGF-1 will be low because your ALS stabilizes the ternary complex. Without ALS, the complex disintegrates, and IgFBP3 is and IGF-1 are just quickly metabolized. Growth hormone binding protein will be normal because you've got actually a normal growth hormone receptor. It's downstream that there's a problem. But the ratio will typically be low. It may be right at the bottom of normal, but usually it will be low. IGF-1 resistance, so these are patients who have these IGF-1 mutations. And so then you'll have the classic picture of growth hormone resistance. You'll have a high growth hormone, but you'll have a high IGF-1. And IgFBP3 may be high, or more commonly, it's in the upper normal range, but the ratio is high. So the ratio gives you the clue that there's something abnormal. In Noonan, so another growth hormone resistance condition, so in this example, SHP2 gain of function mutation, so a partial growth hormone receptor defect. I mean, the Noonan's genes are all in the RAF, RAS, MEK, ERK pathway, so it's all affecting the second messenger signaling of growth hormone. So you'll have a normal, apparently normal growth hormone secretion, although there are some cases of Noonan's that have growth hormone deficiency as well, but the IGF-1 will be in the low normal range, the IGF-BP3 also, but ALS, if you can measure it, and growth hormone binding protein will be normal, but the ratio is low or low normal. So it's again giving you a clue that there is a partial block to the action of growth hormone. And Turner syndrome looks a bit similar. It is a somewhat analogous situation in terms of how it looks biochemically. So again, that low normal ratio will be a good clue that there is actually something worth looking for. So let's look at Ethan. So Ethan is a very short boy, minus 2.6 standard deviations. He had a growth hormone peak of 11.2 on a stimulation test. His IGF-1 standard deviation score was somewhat low, minus 1.4 standard deviations. And his molar ratio is in the low normal range. So if we look at the picture, then you can see that he had a PTPN11 gain of function mutation, leading to overactivity of SHP2 and partial blockade of growth hormone downstream signaling. So IGF-1 synthesis is blunted, but it's not completely abnormal. But the ratio gives it away. So you've got a mildly low IGF-1 SD score, mildly low BP3. Growth hormone binding protein will be normal. And the IGF generation test will show a growth hormone response. I mean, that's where I see the main value of the IGF generation test. It confirms whether there's a biochemical response to growth hormone that would justify a longer trial of growth hormone therapy. And we know that actually in Noonan's, because of this growth hormone resistance that they have, they typically need a much higher dose. So we use a Turner syndrome dose in Noonan syndrome because that's an analogous situation. So he is a boy, so he had the web neck, pulmonary stenosis, the wide-spaced nipples, the low-set ears, very characteristic gestalt of Noonan syndrome. But I have to say, having seen many, many cases of Noonan syndrome over the years, I can recognize, maybe 40% of the cases clinically, but the other 60% you really don't know unless you actually do the genes. So I think genetics is going to become more important, increasingly important in the future. So are there any other situations when we can use the ratio? Well, yes, if you had measured it, let's say you have a child presenting with hypothyroidism, then you would find that the IGF-1 and BP3 ratio would be suppressed in proportion. Even though the IGF-1 may be low, the BP3 will also be low. You need the thyroxine for growth hormone receptor expression. And then you can just treat the child and then remeasure the IGF1 and BP3 and see what happens. Malnutrition and chronic illness, the IGF1 is really adversely affected by poor nutrition. Untreated celiac disease would be another. So you will see the IGF1 fall disproportionately to IgFBP3, but the ratio is usually preserved. In obesity, independently of growth hormone drives IGF1 synthesis, but IgFBP3 is usually reduced. So you have you may well have a growth hormone deficient response on the stimulation test, but they're not truly growth hormone deficient, and the normal ratio is giving you a clue to that. In type 1 diabetes, which I mentioned is a growth hormone resistant state, then that low portal insulin is impeding IGF1 synthesis. So by negative feedback, you get a ratcheting up of growth hormone secretion. And in extreme cases, Moriak syndrome, for example, then you have, massive growth hormone levels, but the child is not growing and they're prepubertal and they have, fatty liver. And we've discussed in Ped Endo Club before that actually this is unmasking a latent genetic disorder of glycogen metabolism. And then what about CKD and liver disease? So one of the challenges with CKD is that you don't actually get rid of IgFBP3. So it often reaches very high levels with CKD, and that binds IGF1 more and impedes growth more. So you can't really use the ratio in CKD or, for that matter, in advanced liver disease, because these are all equally synthetic markers of liver function as well, the ALS, the BP3, the IGF1. And in acromegaly or growth hormone excess, you're going to have a high IGF1 relative to BP3, the ratio is elevated. So let's look at Priya. So Priya, a girl with a slightly low IGF1, minus 2.1 standard deviation. So BP3 is also somewhat low. But the molar ratio is actually normal. And so what is the clue? It really is her thyroid function. You can see her free T4 is only 6.2, her TSH is 48. So the normal ratio is a very good clue that this is not primarily a growth hormone problem. And so primary hypothyroidism, you start treatment with thyroxine, and then recheck. And you can see at 6 months, if you look at the right-hand side, the height velocity has improved, which is obviously a very good clue. And the IGF1 and IgFBP3 standard deviation scores have normalized with a normal ratio. So you can make mistakes with the ratio. So one is accidentally using the mass ratio instead of the molar ratio. Obviously, if you are using the mass ratio, which I do not recommend, then you need to use the appropriate normal range for the mass ratio. The molar ratio is better and more appropriate. If you're using the wrong reference range, then that's going to be misleading. So if, for example, you're using the reference range for a 14-year-old, but actually this is a child with constitutional delay, then you should use the IGF1 and IgFBP3 reference ranges for bone age. And other conditions can suppress IGF1 independently of growth hormone, as we've discussed, so hypothyroidism, steroids, chronic illness, and they will affect the ratio even without growth hormone deficiency. Now, if the child is not growing well, you may still elect to treat them with growth hormone, but it's not inevitable that they must be treated with growth hormone. Obesity, I mentioned that obesity can give you a growth hormone deficiency picture without actually being growth hormone deficient. Most obese children are actually rather tall because food intake drives IGF-1 independently of growth hormone. So obese children usually have a low IGF-1 standard deviation score and a low ratio due to growth hormone resistance from excess free fatty acids and not truly growth hormone deficient. And so you've got to make an adjustment for the BMI being high. So I think, if a child is obese but not short, I certainly wouldn't be going down the road of evaluating them for growth hormone deficiency without looking for other things first. And now at the beginning of puberty, your IGF-1 will go up before your IgFBP3 goes up. So you get a little surge of IGF-1 relative to BP3, and that is normal in puberty. So don't overinterpret it and use the puberty-specific reference ranges. So 5 things to remember. The ratio adds a signal that IGF-1 and BP3 alone can miss. And if you have the triple picture, low ratio, high growth hormone peak, you have growth hormone resistance. And if you have a high ratio on growth hormone therapy, that's telling you you've got high free IGF-1. You certainly need to reduce the dose unless there's some extenuating circumstance, and use the puberty-specific reference ranges as we discussed. And the ratio is a tool, not a diagnosis. Doesn't replace the other evaluations that we do. This is a useful, a valuable piece of the jigsaw puzzle, I would say, rather than replacing our previous tests. So I have created a calculator, as I mentioned, so hopefully Hussein will share that with everybody, and you'll feel free to use it if you like it. It's a straightforward thing to use. There is a simple calculator, and there's also, if you really have a complex case and you've got advanced markers, you can go to the full calculator, and there's also a clinical guide that has details in it to help you understand the ratio. So that's it for my talk. So let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Prof. Nando, for an excellent presentation. I would like to just ask you if you can see this tool as a screening or monitoring in the next future guideline.
I don't know, is the short answer. I think it's still, I would say, finding its place, but the fact that we don't have good markers of growth hormone secretion means that, and we're already measuring these things, it's a very simple thing to actually just evaluate the ratio. And I think it's if you're using that little calculator, it's a very simple calculation to do. So it's not a complex thing. You're not having to divide by the molecular weight and stuff to calculate the ratio. So because the calculator does it for you, so that's easier. So I hope so is the short answer, but I don't know.
Thank you. Very interesting cases. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right, sir. Why don't you run a show of the calculator? I put it already on the website, on the Ped Endo Cafe website, so it's ready for everyone to use it. But why don't you show us a demo how to use it?
Okay, let me, I'll have to share this with you, won't I? So let me just get it up on my system. I should have been prepared. I should have known that Hussein would want me to show it to you.
Yeah.
But I was a dummy, you see.
That's okay. People are asking for the recording of this podcast. Yeah, guys, it will be available. It's all of our podcasts with Prof. Nando Thalanj are available on our website. I will type it on the chat box if you are not familiar with our website. So lots of AI tools being generated and available for free. So feel free to use it. And please give us your feedback. If whenever you use it and you found it useful or not, then let us know.
So that's very kind, Hussein. So I've brought up the calculator. So there's the quick calculator, which is what I would recommend that you would use unless you're feeling particularly keen on doing a lot of work. And then there is a full calculator, which I'll show you briefly. So you've got fields for IGF1 and BP3. So let's just put in some numbers. So IGF1, we'll say, well, it's 135, and we'll say the reference range is 100 to 345. Oops. Sorry, I'm a dummy. 345. Now, some labs will report the IGF1 as an SD score. And obviously, if they're kind to you and do that, then you can just plug the SD score straight in. Same for BP3 as well, if you're lucky. So now, depending on how your IgFBP3 is reported, it may come as you may have to multiply by 1,000 to get the appropriate units. So here I've put nanograms per mil, but you can see there are other units available for reference. So let's put in, let's see, what can I do? 3, 3, 4, 5. And then we'll make this reference range 3,500 to 6,000 as it suggested. So then, having entered the data, which doesn't take too long, I think, then you can just calculate it, and it will give you an analysis. So you've got a IGF1 below average, an IgFBP3 which is low, and the molar ratio is actually normal. So this is unlikely to be growth hormone deficiency. It's not impossible, and you can copy the result to the clipboard if you want to paste it into your note that you're doing. So just copy result, and it will just be available then for you to use. So does that look all right? Is that simple enough?
It's very simple.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to give yourself more work, then you can do the full calculator, which that's where you're going to have to sit down for 20 minutes with the results in front of you and enter everything in. There are some fields, such as for the ALS down here. Most people won't have an ALS measurement that they can refer to. Same with growth hormone binding protein. I don't think I asked for that in this one. So bone age. If you've got things like the height velocity, that can be helpful. And you'll say what you're suspecting. So you can put one of these different diagnoses. So one of the interesting uses of the ratio is that we know that in Prader-Willi syndrome, they are really responsive to the free IGF1. So using the ratio, because you often have a very obese child, and that really makes the interpretation of IGF1 and BP3 difficult. But using the ratio is giving you an indicator of whether they're getting enough growth hormone or not, or indeed too much, although that's relatively uncommon. So that's the calculator, and it's a very simple name. It's just IGF1 BP3.manus.space. So that's the web page. So I'll stop the sharing now.
Does it correct for the bone age? So does the IGF1 get corrected for the bone age in this calculator?
It doesn't. You have to do that yourself, because basically you have to choose the reference range that's appropriate for the bone age. The calculator can't know that. So it doesn't have a way, because the lab reference ranges are all lab specific. So we have no way of knowing, how many different analyzers are there, how many different methods for measuring IGF1 and BP3. So I think you would have to do that yourself. Sorry for that extra burden, but it's not too much work. And I don't normally, so when I'm doing the IGF1 and IgFBP3 SD score, it's only when I'm getting results that I think, oh, let me do the correction. So it's classically the boy with constitutional delay that I really don't believe is growth hormone deficient, that I'll be making that correction. Sometimes you'll have a younger child who's just extremely short, maybe an 8-year-old who's the height of a 5-year-old, and then it will be clearly appropriate to use the bone age or the range appropriate for that bone age.
Wonderful. So I'm trying to
So
be kind and not asking many questions. I'll
no,
leave that to
please.
Noor.
I love the questions. That's always the highlight
I'm
of
trying to
these
be
things.
kind to Noor as well. So
I have one question. What are the major limitations that a clinician should suspect while using?
Well, I don't think there are major limitations. I think the main thing to be aware of would be if you thought there was something, some other reason why the IGF-1 would be low. So if it's a child who's, as I said, got celiac disease or poorly controlled type 1 diabetes or um, hypothyroidism, these would be reasons why the ratio isn't really going to be helping you. So what you would do then is you would normalize the physiology as much as you can. Obviously, it's easier said than done in diabetes, and then reevaluate. So I think that would be the way to go. So you just have to try and improve the situation, and then you recheck the IGF-1 and BP3 and the ratio to see what it's telling you. There can be other situations. So I think you could have a normal ratio and have a very high IGF-1 and BP3. I think there's still some merit in, if that was a child on growth hormone treatment, you would want to reduce the growth hormone dose, even if you were assuring yourself, well, at least there's not a high IGF-1, but probably the child is having more growth hormone than they need. They don't need to have such a high growth hormone with a normal ratio. So you can just ease off the gas pedal on the growth hormone, save some money for the health economy or the family if they're paying for the growth hormone.
Thank you, Prof. Nando.
So is the practice now that we should measure the molar ratio before going for growth hormone stimulation test?
Well, that's an interesting question because I think growth hormone tests are themselves, as you know, my opinion of them is really low. They're hot garbage. If you regard them as a potential screening test for growth hormone deficiency, then they don't meet any of the criteria of a screening test. They're not cheap, they're not reliable, they're not safe necessarily. Even the insulin stress test, which is a maximally dangerous test, has a reproducibility of about, so the R value, if you correlate successive tests, is 0.7. Now, if you take the R squared, so 0.7 squared, that's 49 or 0.49. So you can say, well, 49% of the variability in the response to insulin stress testing is due to growth hormone. So 51% is everything else. So, that's the supposed best test, a test we wouldn't even use in a child. So, and everything else is much less than that. So I prefer personally to do the arginine test. The arginine test at least is safe if you have access to it. I don't have access to it in my current clinic, so I refer them to one of my colleagues, Dr. Rehan Ghanem at Metabolic in Dubai, so she can do the arginine test for me. And so that, I think, no one ever died from being short. So I'd rather they had a good experience of the growth hormone test than a very negative one. And the glucagon test is really horrid. So and that's the second best option, and it's often used as because people do measure cortisol in the glucagon test, but we know that in a quarter of cases it's not even getting a proper cortisol response on the glucagon test. So half the time you're having to do something else, and if you're worried about the cortisol for any reason, you can combine the synacthin test and the arginine test in one, and it's actually cheaper than doing the full glucagon test with cortisol and growth hormone at each time point. So
interesting. So, Noor, do you have more questions?
No, I finished.
You finished. Okay. So we know that many clinicians they become nervous when they see the IGF-1 is rising plus above +2 standard deviation score. So now with the molar ratio, I think now that could help distinguishing whether patients who are generally overtreated from those who are simply responding well.
It's just occurred to me that there is another situation when it can be misleading. So let me just quickly touch on it,
Go on.
which is long-acting growth hormone. So when would you measure the IGF-1 BP3 ratio with long-acting growth hormone? And the answer is you should really measure the trough, not at the peak, or rather the average level. So the day 4 level, which is when we're normally doing the IGF-1 measurement on long-acting growth hormone, because that will actually appear to give you a high IGF-1 relative to BP3. Certainly, if you do it in the first half of the week, day 2 or 3, you'll have a high ratio. So just be aware that there can be situations when it's misleading with long-acting growth hormone. So, but I'm not recommending measuring the IGF-1 and BP3 on day 5 or day 6. But if you were to do that, that would be the optimal time as far as the ratio is concerned. So forgive me for forgetting to mention that earlier.
Okay, thank you very much. You covered it now. So there, you showed us the ratio is very useful. Why do you think it hasn't yet become part of routine international growth assessment guidelines?
Well, I think if there was a ready tool to actually allow you to use it, then I think it would be used. It has to be practicable, doesn't it? I don't think people feel, I mean, even as it is, with the long-acting growth hormone, people aren't necessarily very comfortable about adjusting the IGF-1 for the day of the week when they had the injection, sorry, when they had the blood test after the injection. And that's a pretty straightforward calculation, actually. So I think, there's a reluctance to use tools that are unfathomable or unhelpful. And I just think the ratio does deserve a place in our practice, particularly in the diagnosis side, and does add additional information and monitoring as well. So I think there's value in it. And now, if people like this tool and it becomes widely used, I'm sure there's other people who've invented similar tools around the world, then maybe it will become more recognized and more popular.
So now the tool became available on our website, free for our audience. Do you recommend or do you suggest that we carry on a research project to go and revise all the previously done IGF-1,
Well,
IgFBP3,
I
and
think this
clinical
would be
diagnosis?
this would be golden, wouldn't it? Because we can actually do a beautiful retrospective study, in a big center like Al Jalila, where we probably do 100 growth hormone tests a year. You could look back over the last year or two, gather up all, anyone who's having a growth hormone test should have had an IGF-1 and an IGFBP3. So you can then look at the ratio and look at the outcome and see what it's telling you. So it's a very simple retrospective study. The idea will be to do it prospectively. And again, in a big place like Al Jalila, you could do it prospectively. It's actually a very nice research study, if anyone is so minded to do it,
So
because
we
you'll get enough cases over a year to have a worthwhile cohort.
so we give a chance to Noor to lead on this study.
Absolutely. If Noah would like to, I'd be
Yeah, sure.
delighted.
Okay, so we will discuss the details later on. I just received a message asking you, Prof. Nando, after thanking you for the amazing presentation, when would you consider growth hormone peak as high?
So, so abnormally high, bearing in mind I think there's a whole lot of hocus pocus spoken about growth hormone, by the way, but by and large, the growth hormone peak greater than 13.3 or 40 million international units, as it was in my days, then greater than 13.3 should be raising a concern that this is actually someone with growth hormone resistance for some reason, or growth hormone, a bioinactive growth hormone. or just neurosecretory dysfunction. I mean, I can tell you the very first child I diagnosed with NSD, there was a child, a tiny, tiny child with classic growth hormone deficient appearance. She had a cleft palate at birth, and I just thought, this is growth hormone deficiency. I had no doubt in my mind about the diagnosis clinically. Did a growth hormone peak, and she had a peak level of 14.4. And you think, oh, for goodness sake, that makes no sense. So I didn't believe it. I did pituitary MRI, and she had no pituitary. And you think, well, how can she be making all of this growth hormone? She doesn't even have a pituitary gland, for goodness sake. You cannot rely on growth hormone tests. They let you down when you need them to. Basically, my interpretation of a growth hormone test is this. If the growth hormone test agrees with what I think, I believe it. If it doesn't agree with what I think, I don't believe it. And so I think then if you're in the non-believing group, you have to look for other lines of evidence to support your consideration of what you want to do. So that girl, a girl called Laura, whom I remember very well, she grew magnificently. And, she'd just come to the end of growth a little before I left Norwich in the UK to come to UAE. And she had a final height of 168 centimeters.
Wow.
So she had done wonderfully well. And for the first 2-3 years, she grew over 10 centimeters a year, making up for lost time. She was so growth hormone deficient, and yet her growth hormone test had shown a high peak.
Amazing. Amazing. Right, so I think we are coming to the end. Thank you very much for your time. Dear audience, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Please visit the website for any updates. We keep coming up with new AI tools. The tool that Prof. Nando just mentioned is already there for you to access. And I think he just put the link in the chat box as well for you to access it. Follow us in the Pediatric Endocrine WhatsApp group, especially now we got a new research. We just mentioned that using the AI tool now just been released in terms of revising our previous diagnosis and then compare it with our clinical diagnosis that we've made, compare it with the growth hormone stimulation test that we have performed, and let's see where we're going to reach from this kind of research.
If there is demand for a French version of the tool or a Spanish version of the tool, I'm very happy to do that. It's not difficult with the blessing of AI that we have nowadays. So I can sort that out if there are those who would like.
I will feed back to you.
A foreign language version.
I will feedback that to you. Lovely. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening. And see you again in one of our coming podcasts and webinars with Prof. Nando Thalanj. Keep safe and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.